영상이 시작되기 전에 먼저 등장할 5개의 문장을 보여드릴게요. 빈칸에 들어갈 표현을 유추해보세요. 단어 하나하나를 직역하지 않고 전체 의미에 맞게 의역하고자 노력합니다. 그게 바로 영어식 사고의 출발이에요. 그럼 시작해볼까요?
What were these key carves out? Obviously critical for Boeing. That would hike up car prices significantly. Imagine the political fallout. An unintended consequence, but a hugely beneficial one.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something, well, pretty fascinating in international trade. How can a major player score a win without even really being part of the main negotiation? And our mission really is to figure out how Germany's car industry ended up as this sort of silent winner in a US-EU tariff deal. It's a classic case of what you might call a spillover benefit, right? Unexpected gain. So let's unpack this. What was the U.S. actually threatening at the start? What was the big picture goal?
Yeah, it's interesting because the initial threat was quite broad. The U.S. floated this plan for a pretty hefty 15% tariff. And it wasn't just one thing. It covered a huge range of European imports cars, sure, but also luxury goods, pharmaceuticals, even semiconductors. The aim seemed pretty clear. First, protect U.S. industries. Second, put some real economic pressure on the EU, maybe get deeper trade links. It was quite an opening shot.
Okay, so a really wide net, this 15% threat, designed to hit Europe where it hurts. But then things started to shift. Deals get made, exceptions appear. And that's where it gets interesting, isn't it? What were these key carve-outs, and what do they tell us about what the U.S. really cared about?
Exactly. The 15% tariff, well, it did go ahead in part, but crucial exemptions were made. The U.S. was very careful to exclude things vital to its own economy. Think about aircraft and parts, obviously critical for Boeing, generic drugs important for keeping healthcare costs down, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, stuff from companies like ASML in the Netherlands, super important for building up chip production in the States. And the big one for our story, automobiles. These weren't like favors to the EU, they were strategic moves, protecting their own giants, managing inflation, securing key tech.
Right, that's a key distinction. Not concessions, but self-interest driving these exclusions. And focusing on cars specifically, the reasons become even clearer, don't they? What were the main calculations behind the U.S. deciding, okay, no tariffs on cars?
Well, there were about 4 main drivers, all very much focused domestically. First, American consumers. A 15% tariff. That would hike up car prices significantly. Imagine the political fallout, plus the effect on inflation overall. Just not really feasible from a consumer angle, a real non-starter.
Makes sense. And I guess jobs played a big role too, American jobs.
Absolutely. That's the second point. You've got major German brands, BMW, Mercedes, VW, with huge factories right here in the U.S. They employ thousands of Americans. Tariffs would hit those operations hard. Jobs, investment, all that would be at risk. Third reason, avoiding retaliation, tit for tat. The U.S. knew if it tariffed EU cars, the EU would likely hit back at U.S.-made cars. That hurts American exports.
So protect consumers, protect U.S. jobs tied to German brands, avoid a trade spat. The fourth factor was intense lobbying. You had U.S. car dealers, suppliers, business groups all weighing in heavily. They were making the case very strongly that auto tariffs would actually hurt American workers and businesses more than European ones. Their voices were definitely heard. So when you put it all together, the U.S. acts purely out of self-interest, protecting consumers, jobs, avoiding retaliation, listening to its own industry. And Germany, whose economy leans so heavily on car exports, especially to the U.S., they just benefit massively. They didn't really have to argue the case themselves. America's own strategic choices handed them this well, accidental gift.
Precisely. It's a quiet victory because Germany wasn't the one making these arguments directly in the negotiation. The U.S. made the arguments for them, effectively, because of its own internal priorities. Because Germany's auto sector is so central to its economy and so reliant on the U.S. market, America's decision became this huge, indirect win for Berlin.
So the big takeaway here seems to be that in global trade, sometimes the most significant results aren't from direct confrontation. Sometimes you win because someone else's strategic needs just happen to align perfectly with your interests. An unintended consequence, but a hugely beneficial one. Germany secured access for its most vital industry without really lifting a finger in that specific fight. Almost like finding a winning lottery ticket on the street.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? And maybe a question for you, our listeners. How often do you think these kinds of quiet, indirect benefits shape world events? Where the real strategic advantage isn't loudly proclaimed but happens silently, almost accidentally. Something to ponder.
영어와 시사경제 두 마리 토끼를 한 번에 잡는 알찬 시간 되셨다면 구독과 좋아요를 꾹 눌러주세요. 감사합니다.